So you should have a copy of Class Notes 13 with you as you listen to this lecture and fill out any information on Radu that I talk about in this lecture, as well as you should add to those notes as you listen to the chapters for today, chapter 55 and 56 and 57, and add anything about the character of Radu that you notice from those chapters. So I'm going to give you a basis to work on here in this lecture. As we finish up our analysis of the problem of evil, we've surveyed these literary responses and depictions and analysis of the problem of evil throughout the semester. And as we wind this up and sum it up in Richard Adams' novel, Shardik, so Adams is adding a couple of particular insights to this. In fact, with the introduction of Radu in chapter 49, Adams is beginning to wrap up his final exposition, his final the final thematic things he wants to say about the problem of evil in Shardik. And remember, this novel is directed towards believers, and the main characters are believers. Now, not Radu. Radu is not a believer in the bear Shardik. He's from the south of the country, Yodashe, among those southern peoples who are rebelling against the empire of Bekla. And he does not, he is the worship of the bear is strictly an Ortalgan religion, the belief in Shardik, and Shardik is the god of the Ortalgans. And as I go back, I want you to remember where I started in our first lecture. Think Judah, think the Hebrew God, think Elohim when you're thinking Ortalga, think Rome when you think Bakla. So even though things are not, there's not a one-to-one correspondence here, if I were pushed, I would have to say the novel Shardik is more of this expanded long parable than an allegory. But so right, the Jews never ruled in Rome. They never built Rome. Right, that's given. And Adams is intentionally creating these likenesses with these dissimilarities as well, because he's trying to keep us from approaching this story and the theme he's talking about from the point of view, hey, already been there, done that. I've heard the story. I know the lingo. I know the language. I know how it ends. Because remember, he's trying to awaken, if you will, something in the hearts and minds and spirits of the believers in his audience. So with that in mind, the introduction of Radu in chapter 49 is very important. Radu appears in this last part of the book. He appears just when we're almost to the climax of the action in chapter 54, and he's a very important element of that action and of a critical figure in the climax of the book. So we're going to take a closer look at the character of Radu in today's lecture. And then on Wednesday, we're going to shift and look at the character Shouter, because Radu and Shouter are, if you will, we have foils here. And we might look at Shouter as a foil, as a character foil to Radu, but we could equally look at Radu as a character foil to Shouter. And which one of these characters is more important to Richard Adams? And I would argue neither is more important. He's using both to make a very important statement about the problem of evil. So remember, character foils like Hamlet and Fortinbras and Laertes, they have to have similarities. And Radu and Shouter are both in the power of Genshad. They're both about the same age. And Shouter is one of Genshad's overseers. And we know from chapter 50 that Genshad is wanting to make Radu an overseer as well. and has offered that possibility to Radu. So here are the similarities. What is different about these two? This is very, very important, because at this point, Adams is he's portraying both in the most dramatic, the strongest fashion, the power of evil. And lest any of you think that he has exaggerated the power of evil. I mean, why do we Christians run and hide from these things? We don't want to know about what evil people are doing to children. We don't want to know about what our use of innocent pornography might be empowering and funding in terms of strengthening the children's pornographic industry, the merchandising of PDF of materials and images and films to pedophiles, and the feeding of those kind of things. We don't want anything to do with that, and yet that is a very real presence in our world. It is the very presence that God sent his son, which we celebrated yesterday, to overcome, not just to resist, but to overcome. And Adams himself fought in World War II. As an Englishman, he was very aware of what the Allies discovered when they freed the concentration camps in Germany and Poland. And so his depiction of evil is not exaggerated. And in fact, if you have any kind of knowledge, less than a superficial knowledge of ancient history and ancient peoples, you understand that this kind of evil and cruelty is very much a part of mankind's history. Remember, God sent that flood because men had become so violent. And some believe, as a consequence, he shortened their lifespans, because the longer men live, the more evil becomes. So given this context, I'm going off a little bit on a tangent here, but I want to address those of you that are recoiling from this story and from the wickedness that is being depicted here in the treatment of these children, vulnerable children. So remember, Lalak and Ganshad and these traders that trade in slave children, they're acquiring their children not by kidnapping, not by force. The children are being given to them because these children are unwanted. Okay? So we have, what is this essential difference then between Radu and Shouter? Radu was the only slave child who was kidnapped, and he had to be kidnapped in order for Genshed to get him. Why? His father wanted him. His father loved him. Radu is a son. He's a son of the Banusar kid. He's a beloved son. He's a prized son. In fact, why Elaroth even joins the Yaudashay rebellion is because of the slave trade, and what fuels his anger and his why his soldiers are there is he is after the recovery of his son. If we look at Shardik leading the Tuginda and Cowderic straight to Zeray, where Melithus was, and they didn't even know she was there, but Shardik knew. So here we have this picture of Shardik as this representative of the Father God, and he is going to find his lost daughter, and that's what Melithus discovers. That's the point of redemption that we talked about in the previous lecture. She recovers her, if you will, daughtership. And remember Melithus's backstory. If you look back, how come, remember when Keldrick asked one of the girls helping the Tuginda in the very beginning of the book, and he says, how did one so young as Melithus acquire so much power and authority, become a priestess at such a young age? And she said, well, she grew up on Quiso. She wasn't recruited. Melithus had been bred on a slave farm that was breeding slaves. And so she had been a fugitive. She had been part of a war to end the slave trade, and that's how she had come to Quiso. So Melithus, like Shouter, was fatherless. She was an orphan. Remember, Keldrick too is an orphan. He has no father or mother. Both of his parents are dead. But we know that he has had a good relationship with his father. His father taught him all of his skills, and he is assumed when he occupies that position of hunter-provider for the Otelgan people, he's assumed this position with its licensing and its territorial rights from his father, who was a hunter before him. So suddenly this father-child relationship has come to the center of our story. It's always been there, but we haven't noticed it too much. But now with Radu, Adams is bringing this to the center and the focus of his story and his development of the problem of evil. So in Adam's eyes, this father-child relationship must be very central to the problem of evil. Now, I want you to think about John Milton and remember what we discovered and how Milton thought about the problem of evil and its source, and why human nature is evil in its essence. And that was the severing of the oneness with the Father that Satan achieved in his temptation of Eve and Adam's subsequent fall. So this father-child relationship is really important. And the primary difference between Radu and Shadow is Radu is a son and Shouter is an orphan. Shouter's father was killed in battle, and his stepfather doesn't want him. He's not a particularly like Holga. How Holga's mother, Mrs. Hopewell, she if a child is supposed to be a representative of a parent, so a parent takes pride or is ashamed of a child, so the extent at which that child represents either the best qualities of the parent or how the parent wants people to perceive him or her as, or they reflect badly on the parental image, the child is more or less loved and wanted. Are you following me here? This is deep stuff. We've plunged way beneath the surface of human nature and the appearance of people, beneath what seems, as Hamlet would say it, and we're moving down into the heart of the human being here. So Shouter is an orphan, but Radu is fully a son. And now I'm going to back up a minute, and I just want to talk about what Adams is showing here and what he's stating about the problem of evil. Your last journal entry will be due on Friday, and it's going to be just the same old. You're going to tell me how Adams defines evil, where he says the source of evil is, how he says people become more or less evil, and how evil is resisted and or overcome. And I'm rather giving you the answers to that, at least as Dr. Graves understands them from her reading of the text. So 4, Adams is showing quite dramatically with Genshet that the focus of evil is to gain control of a man or a woman's will. That the will is all important because actions flow from our will. We don't do anything that our will isn't isn't approving or isn't involved in. Okay? So actions are always the result of the exercise of the human will. And sometimes inaction is the result as well. So again, we have this like not doing something is doing something. It's taking a course of action. It's acting. It's bringing something into being. So choices to do one thing or to do the other, to act or not to act, or the choice between two actions is exercising the will. And this is what brings things into reality. It's through actions. It's not through our words. So at least in this fallen world, God's words may constitute action. So when he says something, it becomes deed immediately. So he spoke creation into the universe. But God is not fallen. There's not this separation, this fragmentation. But see, we're fragmented beings as a result of the fall. So our words can be very different than our actions. There's not this oneness there between what we say and what we do. In fact, the very definition of integrity and to be a person of integrity is when what you say is at one with what you do. So when we say a person has integrity, she or he is a woman or a man of integrity, we're saying that, hey, their word is as good as their deed. That's what Jesus said, I think. You shouldn't swear. You shouldn't swear. Your word should be as good as your deed. So just giving somebody your word is the same, absolutely the same one with doing the deed. But for most of us, what we say and what we do are two separated things. And so here the enemy, evil, the focus of the evil is gaining control of man's will because it's actions that bring things into reality, into being, not words. Words only so far bring things into being as they affect and direct our actions, how we exercise our will. So if the focus of evil is to gain control of the human will, then the means of evil is to break man's mind, break his mind, stop thinking, break down thinking. Don't let people ask questions. Don't let people ask questions. Scare them out of asking questions. Shut the questions down, because once people start asking questions, they start thinking. And if the focus is control of man's will, then you have to have control of man's mind. Because as we've seen throughout the semester, there's this almost joint and marrow connection between the will and the mind. So the will is the place where things come into being. They have substance, they have reality. But the mind is what informs the will. So in Hamlet, we see this battle of the mind. And because Hamlet cannot decide what he thinks, what he believes, what's real mentally in his mind, thoughtfully, then his will is frozen until it's too late to do anything but act out of his bodily impulses and get a lot of people killed. So the means of evil is to break man's mind. And how is the mind of a human being broken? Well, just ask Adolf Hitler. He was a master of this. And surely he was someone that Richard Adams had in mind when he developed the character of Genshed, this living embodiment of evil. Radu said that he's a devil. He's no longer a human being. This other spiritual force of evil has taken control of his body, his actions, bringing itself, evil, into reality. And so how does evil then gain control of a man's mind, break man's mind? Control, how to control, pain, fear, and the promise of power over others. the promise of power, of empowering the person. As long as you don't think and you just do what you're told to do, blind obedience, that's evil's goal, as opposed to seeing obedience, which is Christ's goal, God's plan, his goal for us. He wants us to obey. He's not going to force us to obey. And he doesn't want blind obedience. He wants us to know him. And out of knowing him, we have understanding obedience. So here we go. So inflict pain, hunger, torture, break down the mind, and then just dazzle people with this power, this control over others, and give them that promise of power. And as we will see in Wednesday's lecture, that's exactly what happened to Shouter. And who are the people most vulnerable to this promise of power, but the most powerless themselves? So shutting down the mind, no thinking, no mind, and the bodily desires take over. So all I want to do is be fed. All I want to do is escape the pain. I don't want to feel any more pain. I don't want to feel any more hunger. I want to be comfortable. I want to be at peace, that kind of bodily peace, not mentally, not spiritual, but just relief, pain relief. And so the bodily desires take over, and those bodily desires include other things too, as Flannery O'Connor portrayed in Manly Pointer. When you stop thinking, right, and you're operating what? As one of Milton's animals. Remember? Before the fall? Adam and Eve. What were the differences between people and animals before the fall? Well, animals, all they thought about was food and sex. They didn't think at all. They didn't have minds. After the fall, instead of becoming more like the angels, we saw Adam and Eve become like the animals. Well, all they thought about was food and sex. They weren't thinking clearly. Their ability to think and to reason was completely clouded by bodily desires. So no thinking, no mind. The mind informs the will. And we'll see in this again, guys. So I want to kind of bring this to kind of a summary statement. Go back, review every work we've looked at this semester, including Sophocles. And you're going to see that whenever someone with a seeing eye, a listening ear, looks at people around them, at their neighbor, at the people down the street, at their communities, at their governments, they come to these, at their history, at human history, they come to these very similar conclusions. So the mind informs the will, shut that mind down, and then you've got direct access to the will. All you have to use is the satisfaction of people's bodily desires to control them completely. And then Adams, then he raises this question. So we see this in Shouter. We see this in how Genshed uses fear. He uses hunger. He uses torture to scare those children and control them. And they're not thinking about anything but what do I just have to do to survive? Melithus, when she fled the Tuginda and Shardik at the beginning of the book, right? All she was thinking about was her preserving her flesh, the life of the flesh. And what she discovered was preserving focus and preserving the life of the flesh is not life at all. It is death. And so Adams then comes to this point. He says, but is there more than that? Okay, what is this thing called spirit? So we've looked at mind and will and the body. What is this thing called spirit? Because what we see, and once Radu appears on the scene in chapter 49 through the climax in chapter 54, what we see is that as hard as Genshed tries, he cannot break Radu's spirit. So evil, and we even think, well, is this connection between mind and spirit? And I leave that up to you. I would suggest that's an excellent Bible study for those of you who are so inclined to just study the intersection between mind and spirit in the scripture. But Genshed cannot break Radu's spirit. He almost breaks his mind. And so to finish up today's lecture, and with your notes there with the picture of Radu there, this is what's important. And I'm going to give you page numbers, and I'm going to read some important passages about how Adams develops his theme of resisting evil. And in Radu, we see resisting evil, not overcoming evil necessarily, but resisting it. And Radu is certainly the only character in the whole book that we see steadfastly, continuously is able to resist the power of evil. And where does that ability to resist evil come from? Well, when we first meet Radu, when Radu first talks about Genshed in chapter 50, I want to look at page 475. Radu talks about, middle of the page, he says, God's given in. Now notice, right now I want to call attention to Radu's relationship with God. Now remember, he doesn't believe in Shardik, in the bear, but there was some kind of religion in place, some kind in Yaudashe, some kind of idea of God. And here's Radu. And he's just explained to Keldrick, I touched on this paragraph, I've read you this paragraph before, how Genshed wants him as an overseer, but he doesn't threaten him. Radu has to want to be an overseer. In other words, he has to respond by power becomes all important to him. Now remember, Milton's portrayal of the fall of Satan. Satan's focus on God left the love relationship and became focused on God's power. Well, he has all this control, and I want control. So power being defined and understood as control over oneself. If you will, we use the word agency, of being a free agent, being able to self-determine. And this is strong stuff. This is a very strong undercurrent in our culture and even informs much of our church language and ideas now. And I would challenge you, is it biblical? We like to say, well, God gave us free will. Well, in Milton, we see God, yeah, it was like the potential for free will. There was the potential to exert our will separately from God, but that was not God's desire. God's desire was that our will would always be one with him, because notice where oneness occurs. Oneness doesn't happen in the flesh. Perhaps that's why so many marriages fail. People mistake physical oneness and for real oneness, and it's not at all. Oneness doesn't occur in the mind. Oneness occurs in the will. Jesus said on the cross, he said in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will, but yours, O Father. That example, that expression, that experience of perfect oneness. So perhaps it's like having a free will, exerting our will freely shouldn't be the main goal and focus of a Christian. Maybe it's, how do I reestablish oneness between my will and God's will? And maybe that was one thing Christ did on the cross. He showed us that. It was death to our will, the will that Satan tempted Adam, that he said, all right, God's given you the potential for free will, the opportunity for free will to exert your will differently than he would to do something he wouldn't do it. And that oneness was broken. And then here we have Christ on the cross dying to free will, dying to his right to have free will, and giving his will completely to the Lord, stretching out his arms on that cross and saying, not my will, but your will. That's all that matters, to be one with you, Lord, and to be one in our wills. So we're willing the same thing. You will my death. I will my death. Okay. So here is this, so Keldrick has just said, so this is what Genshed is all about. See, his focus is on gaining control of the will, this power of evil. And so he doesn't want Radu, he's not threatening Radu, you do this or else. When it comes to being an overseer, when it comes to exerting power on his behalf, no, Radu has to be converted. And he uses that word, convert. Genshed has the power to convert people because they like power and they like having power over other people. So even at the smallest level of our lives, we should be aware perhaps of when we like having power over someone else. And who are we one with in that likeness and in exerting our will in that way, from that motivation. So then here's Radu's response then. God has given in. He's confiding to Keldrick. He said deliberately, God's given in. Either that or God's got no power over Genshed. He doesn't really have power over evil. This evil we're living in, this evil world, this evil that people have over children, what they do to children, God does, he must either not care or he really doesn't have any power to do anything about it. I'll tell you something that I shall never forget. Before Thethet, there was a boy with us, a big shambling lad called Balin. He could never have crossed the Vraco. He was clumsy and a bit simple. Genshed put him up for sale along with the girls. The man who bought him told Genshed he wanted to make him a professional beggar. He kept several, he said, and he lived what they brought in. He wanted Balin mutilated to excite pity when he was begging, to bring in more money for the slave master, the owner of the beggar children. Genshed hacked off Balin's hands and held his wrists in boiling pitch to stop the bleeding. He charged the man 43 meld. He said that was his rate for that particular job. So this is Radu. And experiencing that evil and seeing the power of evil manifested over an innocent, helpless, powerless child, other human being, that made Radu feel like God's not as strong as I thought. He's not there. So Radu's thinking, maybe he's an atheist. God's not there. Think about Holga, the pain that Holga's rejection from her mother inflicted in her. Her mother getting rid of her father and then rejecting her father and jettisoning her father out of Holga's life without a care or thought that it would matter to Holga. The pain that was inflicted, and Holga's response is, God must not be there. There must be no God. And then Keldrick gets Radu gets kind of dizzy, and he and Keldrick both are so hungry, they can hardly, it's affecting their balance, their sense of balance. They're starving. And so they start eating leaves at this point. Radu stood up, swayed a moment, and stumbled against Keldrick. It's the hunger, he said. It'll pass off in a moment. He called to Shara, who was running with a long strip of colored weed wound like a torque or bracelet around one thin arm. If there's one thing I've learned, this is Radu speaking, it's that hunger is a form of torture. If there's more food for overseers than slaves, when we get to Linsho, I might become an overseer yet. Cruelty and evil, they're not very far down in anyone. It's only a matter of digging them up, you know. So here's this young boy, like 14 years old. And he's so hungry and he's resisting evil. He's like, I know what Genshed's after. He wants to take over my will, but he ain't going to have it. He's not going to get it. I'm not going to cooperate with evil. I don't care about having power over the people. I care about preserving the life of Shara. I care about Shara, another human being. But he's going, but I am so hungry. And he's kind of making an ironical statement here. But there's this humility in Radu as well. I don't know. I might get to the point. I might be so hungry, I give in. And then we go on. Let's follow this character arc of Radu in today's lecture. We go on to page 487. And we meet Radu again. And Radu is, they've just come up to the Gap of Linsho, which was the only escape route and the only place they were going to get more food. They're out of food now and everyone's starving. And they discover that Elaroth, Radu's father's soldiers, are there and they've secured the gap. And there's no way that Genshed with his starving troop of children are going to get through that gap and get to more food. And here's Radu. And he jumps up, he staggers, he falls, he gets up knee by knee like a cow. This child is on starvation's, the death by starvation's doorstep. Sarkit, he whispered, stretching out his hands, and then barely ladder. Sarkit, he's seen his father's banners there. But Genshed stops him, and the boy's cry when it came was like that of a sick infant, distorted and feeble. Once more he cried, bird-like, and then sank to his knees, sobbing and wringing his hands among the undergrowth. Oh, God, wept Radu. God, only help us. Oh, God, please help us. So he's praying to God, and he's asking for help. And at this stage, remember Melithus? She was standing by the Baron's grave at the end of her rope, asking God for help, when who appears? Keldrick and the Chaginda. Coincidence? Is that coincidence? Or is there another force? And this force is acting through human beings and through time to bring actions together and consequences of actions together. At that moment, Lalak appears, and this alternative plan for escape with Lalak's money and the opportunity to buy boat passage across the river farther down. And then we have that verse that I referenced in the last lecture where about this oneness, that it was Genshed who had the power to make the lame walk. And not God himself could melt this cold or undo the least part of Genshed's will. This is this feeling of God's nowhere on the scene. Either there is no God, or he doesn't care, or he's just weak. He's not this strong. It's this dualistic kind of picture where evil must be as strong as God or stronger. And then they arrive at this ruined village. They stumble into this ruined village on their way down from the Gap of Linsho, heading towards the river where they hope to use Lalak's money. We know Genshed's real plan, which is to murder Lalak, seize the money, and Radu, and escape with the two of them. And he says it was playing the Genshed. I'm on page 491 at the start of chapter 52, and our focus is on Radu. Stay with me, okay? And Genshed no longer cared whether the children lived or died. They could just drop off in the weeds, and he wasn't bothered. He was only focused on keeping Keldric and Radu with him. And here we see Radu entering the final stages of disintegration. The child is dying. As when two animals have fought, the one that is beaten seems to grow smaller as it slinks away, since turning back from the edge of the forest where he saw his father's soldiers. And Radu called out, but he couldn't summon the energy to resist Genshed's will and shout louder or stumble forward and reveal their position to the soldiers and gain, at least if he died in the effort, gain the freedom of the other children. So now Radu had regressed from a youth to a child. The pride of bearing with which he had carried his rags and his sores, as though they were honorable insignia of the house of Sarkid, had given place to an exhausted misery like that of a survivor from some disaster. He moved uncertainly, as though unable to pick his way for himself. His will is being broken. And how's it being broken? Hunger, and then this exercise of power on Genshed to show, hey, you can't do this unless I give you permission. You can't even yell for help when your father's soldiers are 20 feet away from you. And so unable to pick his way for himself, and once with hands covering his face, gave way to a fit of sobbing which ceased only when breath failed him. As he lifted his head, his eyes met Keldric's with a look of panic-stricken despair, like that of an animal staring from a trap. Why didn't Radu step forward and shout and reveal their presence to his father's soldiers? I'm afraid to die, he whispered. He was afraid of dying. He backed away because Genshed seemed to have the power of life or death. If he had done that, if he had shouted, if he'd gone forward and tried to reach the soldiers, Genshed would have killed him. Keldric could find no answer. I don't want to die, repeated Radu desperately. Okay, those were my father's soldiers. And so here Radu is meeting this. He's in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's staring death in the face and he's shrinking back from it. I don't know if my resistance to evil goes so far as dying, as sacrificing my own life. And then as a result of that, Keldric reveals to Radu that he was indeed the king of Bakla, Krendric, his true identity, and that it's he who's responsible for the slave trade and directly responsible for the terrible conditions and situation, this life and death moment that Radu finds himself in. And you know what Radu says? Well, Radu says this on page 495, second page from the end of the chapter. And Keldric goes, Radu says, are we really to die? Are you sure there's no help for it? It was a frightened, staring child who looked up at Keldric in the last light of the day. Well, my time has come to die. I know that, said Keldric. The ill-cut soldiers would have killed me in Cabine, but your father stopped them. When he sent me across the Vreco, he told me, this is Eloreth, that if they ever found me again, they'd kill me on sight. So I shall die, either at at the hands of your father's soldiers or at Genshed's. And here's how Radu responds. If my father could forgive you then, Krendric, I can forgive you now. And what we see is Radu, even at this complete dissolution of mind, body, and will, who's he one with? What's informing his response? My father's will. So my will is gone. But I am so one with my Father, Elarath, that if he forgave you, Keldrick, I can forgive you. So it's what is the secret here? What's going on with